Sie täuschen sich alle, die glauben, dass auch nur ein Riss in das Gefüge unserer einzigen Bewegung gekommen sei. Sie steht fest, so wie dieser Block hier.
Hitler and other German nationalists absolutely hated the Treaty of Versailles.
What the Treaty of Versailles does is to basically order Germany to pay for the war. The Germans look at this and go, this is just a humiliation. It was a mood of revolution, a mood of deep dissatisfaction, a mood of instability, and it felt like the country was on the brink of collapse.
In that climate of hopelessness and despair, Hitler promised something different. Hitler promised that he could make Germany great again and bring her out of this economic crisis.
Being no doubt that the German people are really pretty down. Most people are struggling to survive. They're looking for a strong leader. They want someone to emerge who's going to, take the country out of this kind of hell and transform it.
Hitler, Sieg! Sieg!
And of course, like any really brilliant public speaker, he's going to use that to his advantage. It's like a conductor with an orchestra.
2 oder 3 Monate vergangen sind, wird euer Terror beseitigt sein. Verwahren wir das von alter
The takeover is now complete.
Hitler was a moody and surly child. His father was 52 years old, Alois, and his mother, Clara, was quite a bit younger. So he was much closer to his mother.
Hitler's father was really abusive. He would often beat the young Adolf after he had had too much to drink. But his mother, on the other hand, was very loving, and she would often try to throw herself between Adolf and his abusive father. Of course, what Hitler's learning from his father at this very early stage is that if you want to dominate someone, you've got to be strong and you've got to be brutal. There's this extract in Mein Kampf in which Hitler remembers his old history teacher, a man called Leopold Potsch, and the profound effect that his classes had on the man who would lead the Nazi party. Potsch himself was born in what we today call Slovenia, but he was this kind of nationalist who believed in a kind of, wider Germany, and he despises the rulers of Austria-Hungary, the Habsburgs. And what Potsch frequently voices are his political views in the classroom, and there's no doubt that they are shaping Hitler's own nationalism.
Hitler lived a life of hardship when he moved to Vienna, so he was hoping to be accepted to the Viennese School of Fine Art, and he was rejected, which he took as a very strong slight and personal insult.
Hitler was an aspiring artist, and, he wanted to follow his passion. He applies twice to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, a really prestigious institution, but he's rejected twice. And between those two rejections, there was another blow for Hitler, and that was the death of his mother in 1907 from breast cancer.
And this was a very, very hard blow, of course, because he was so attached to her. So he kind of made his way, kind of eked out a very poor hand-to-mouth existence selling postcards that he'd made, and living in men's hostels. So it was a very difficult life, his years in Vienna.
And he says of this period that I owe it to that period that I grew hard, and I'm still capable of being hard.
Once war was announced, Hitler was in Munich at the time, and in fact he's seen pictured in one of the squares there where the war was being proclaimed.
And what he does is to volunteer to join the Bavarian army. And he goes off and fights, and he's present at the first Battle of Ypres, he's at the Battle of the Somme, he's at the Battle of Arras, and he's even at Passchendaele. And at Somme, he's actually wounded. So he has what people call a good war. He's even decorated for bravery, and gets the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914.
He was wounded in the war and in fact blinded temporarily.
You have a German medic, a man called Dr. Edmund Forster, and he claims at this stage to have treated Hitler by hypnosis for what he calls hysterical blindness in 1918. And what he does is he appeals to Hitler's desire to be like a god.
With the recovery from blindness, he suddenly seemed to think he had a mission in life, that there was something preordained, the fact that he'd survived the war and that he'd recovered his sight, that he had a mission to fulfill.
Ein Sowjetzeichen soll er vor sich hertragen und wir werden in unserem Zeichen wieder siegen. Friedliebend und aber auch tapfer ist. Und ihr müsst friedfertig sein.
Hitler's wartime experience really reinforces his sense of German patriotism. And when Germany capitulates in 1918, in November, he's incredibly bitter. And it's that bitterness that's really going to start to form his political ideology. Hitler's like a lot of other German nationalists at this time. He believes in this thing called the Dolchstoßlegende. That's the stab in the back myth.
Hitler pinned the blame for the loss of the First World War on what he called the November criminals, those who had signed the armistice on behalf of Germany. So really he believed that had the German army been allowed to continue on the battlefield, they would have won. And from here came this myth of the stab in the back, that the army had been stabbed in the back. And this became very popular among German right-wing and paramilitary groups and so on.
And those responsible for it were people like Hitler claimed, so Jews and Marxists, and basically anybody who had signed the armistice that ended the fighting.
He also was very dismissive of the home front and sort of felt that the nation hadn't been strong enough too. So he kind of had an angle on that as well, about not being happy with the way that the population responded, even though actually they were starving by the end of the First World War, it has to be said. Hitler and other German nationalists absolutely hated the Treaty of Versailles, and this was for a number of reasons. So, first of all, the victorious Allies had blamed Germany for the outbreak of the war. So there was a clause in there called Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which placed the blame for the outbreak of the war squarely on the shoulders of Germany and her allies. So not only that, but also this meant that the Allies could ask for reparations from this nation who had started the war. Very, very hefty sum of money.
And you know, the Germans look at this and go, this is just a humiliation. You know, not only have we lost the war, we're now being made to pay for it. And what they really object to is what's known as Article 231, which actually interprets as declaring Germany responsible for the war itself.
And also, most importantly, that the treaty restricted the German army to 100,000, as well as not allowing tanks, military vehicles, and nor conscription. So this meant that the German capacity to wage a new war was very seriously restricted.
The mood in Germany at the end of World War I was that of a humiliated and defeated people and nation. This fight had been going on for 4 years. Millions of people had died, and no one had got anything, or no one had got anywhere. It was a mood of revolution, a mood of deep dissatisfaction, a mood of instability, and it felt like the country was on the brink of collapse.
So in the aftermath of the First World War, prices had increased greatly. So by the time of the hyperinflation, you saw people going out with wheelbarrows worth of money because the currency had become practically worthless. So literally a wheelbarrow of money to buy a basic household provision. So the mood in Germany at the end of the First World War was very subdued. There was lots of political, economic and social upheavals and dislocations. So the Kaiser had abdicated, so now he'd been replaced, that rule had been replaced with the Weimar government, which was a liberal democracy. So this is a new experiment in democracy for Germany. And the Weimar Republic was attacked both from left and right in these early years after the war.
What the army had done and the whole experience of war had given Hitler a purpose. What his personal life before the war had been this kind of destitute, homeless, failed artist. In the army, Adolf Hitler was someone. He was a decorated war hero. He felt like a big man. In July 1919, Hitler gets a new job, and this is actually really crucial. One of the first steps that's going to take him to power. And what he's appointed to become is an intelligence agent for a reconnaissance unit of the German army. And what he is, asked to do is to kind of influence other soldiers. But also what he's asked to do is to infiltrate political parties. And one of the parties that Hitler is asked to infiltrate is called the German Workers' Party.
So Hitler became leader of the party by July 1921, so quite early on still. And he was determined to try and grow that party, and of course eventually to make it a party that would allow him into power. The party changed its name from the German Workers' Party to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And there were quite important changes that Hitler made at this early point. One of them was the introduction of a paramilitary wing, so the SA, the Sturmabteilung, or the stormtroopers. And this was important because all the other parties had their own paramilitary organization. And secondly, for the party to have its own newspaper, the Volkische Beobachter, or the People's Observer. And again, this was important because it marked the arrival of the party. All the other parties had their own press.
There are lots of little political parties, being formed in cities all over Germany at this time.
So this was never inevitable. It was never inevitable then that this party was going to be the one that rose to power. So what made the difference? So the difference was made by Hitler and what he was doing and his speeches and the fervour that he whipped up for this ideology.
Hitler's speeches are really vitriolic, but they're very effective and they attract regular audiences. And what he's found, he's got this gift for speaking. He is a natural demagogue, and he's really good at using populist themes, and he labels scapegoats for losing the war. You name it, Jews, communists, whoever Hitler hates on that given moment, he'll lay into them.
Hitler's charisma and his ability to speak so well, to really draw crowds and attract attention to the party, meant that his role was crucial even from an early date.
Listeners are listening and watching this and they're thinking, yes, these are the reasons for our economic hardships. And Hitler's also got this huge personal magnetism. And he's got this instinctive understanding of the psychology of crowds. And of course, like any really brilliant public speaker, he's going to use that to his advantage. It's like a conductor with an orchestra. And what historians have noted is the kind of hypnotic effect that his rhetoric has on these huge audiences. And also people notice, how his eyes, are so effectively used when he's talking to smaller groups. In 1923, Hitler asked for the help of a general from the First World War, a man called Erich Ludendorff, and he says to Ludendorff, I want to have a coup, and I want to take control violently. And this becomes known as the Beer Hall Putsch.
By November 1923, Hitler believed that the Weimar Republic was on the verge of collapse. So together with Ludendorff and a great bevy of supporters, he decided to stage a coup d'etat, a putsch, starting in a beer hall in Munich, so it took the name the Beer Hall Putsch.
In his early years, when he was leading the Nazi party, Hitler was a big admirer of Mussolini. The Nazis had done, what Hitler had done is he looked at Italy, he looked at the Italian fascists, as a model for some of their appearances, some of their policies. And what he has seen is Benito Mussolini's march on Rome in 1922, which had been so successful. And Hitler thinks, well, look, I can do this in Bavaria. And by doing this kind of march, I can actually challenge the government in Berlin. I can take power in the same way as Mussolini did.
And he sort of stormed in, fired a pistol to the ceiling and declared that he was starting a new regime.
Hitler's got a problem because he's not a well-known figure in Germany in 1923 at the time of the attempted putsch.
Whilst Hitler had had some support that had among the armed forces and among the upper classes that had made him believe that this might be possible, the truth is he'd really overestimated that. The Weimar Republic, despite the problems that beset it, was not really on the verge of collapse at this stage.
But actually what the putsch does is brings Hitler to the attention of the wider German nation for the first time. And it's obviously generating big headlines in newspapers all over the world. And then, of course, he's arrested, and you've got this 24-day trial, which is hugely publicised. And what a trial does, you get this process called blowback, giving Hitler a platform to express his kind of vile ideology to the nation.
And so this claim for power was a failure, a fiasco. Hitler ended up being arrested along with many of his followers, and he was imprisoned.
On April the 1st, Hitler is sentenced to 5 years imprisonment at Landsberg prison for his involvement in the Beer Hall Putsch.
And there he dictated Mein Kampf, so his struggles and his political ideas, to Rudolf Hess and Emil Morris.
What this book does is to lay out Hitler's plans in a kind of very rambling, incoherent fashion for transforming German society into a society based on race. So throughout the book, Jews are equated with germs, and they're presented as the international poisoners of society.
Anti-Semitism, anti-Bolshevism were two of the key ideologies. He also despised democracy, and these kinds of ideologies were written in very, very fervent and strong terms in Mein Kampf.
So, according to Hitler's ideology, there was only one solution to this, and that was their extermination.
Ich will heute wieder ein Prophet sein. Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
Including his time on remand, I mean, Hitler only spends just over about a year in prison. It's not that long, considering what he was trying to do. At the time of Hitler's release from prison, politics in Germany it had got a lot less combative, and the economy had improved. So, of course, what this is doing is not providing such fertile ground for Hitler's political agitation, if you like.
So the Nazi Party had been disbanded, and in 1925 he set about refounding the party and also very much promoting his own position as leader in the party. So this is where the origins of the term the Führer came from, that he was the leader of the party, and from there later on that concept of the Führer extended to the whole nation.
As a direct result of the Beerhall Putsch, what the Nazi Party and its organisations suffer from is a ban. You know, they're basically outlawed in Bavaria. And Hitler gives this really inflammatory speech on the 27th of February, after which he's barred from public speaking by the Bavarian authorities. And that bar is going to remain in place until 1927.
Having been imprisoned, Hitler changed his views somewhat on how he would be able to obtain power. So he could see that it wasn't going to be possible to seize power in that way, and that he would have to use the tools of democracy to assert his own control. So in the mid-1920s, the political climate had changed somewhat. So these were the golden years of the Weimar Republic. The Republic was in a more settled political situation, also economically and socially. So this was the sort of swinging 20s, the golden 20s. So the cabaret and lots of advances in artistic movements and architecture, like the Bauhaus movement. So this kind of, and expressionist art. So there's kind of quite a lot of cultural advance and progress in Weimar society. And politics not so much at the forefront during these years. The Great Depression, of course, shattered those golden years of the Weimar Republic.
The Great Depression was this severe worldwide economic depression that took place between 1929 and you know, basically lasted a whole decade till about 1939. What it saw was a major fall in stock prices in the United States, and you see basically an economic cataclysm worldwide.
So the economic crisis came to one head in 1923 with a hyperinflation. And then after things settled down through the mid-1920s, with the impact of the Wall Street crash in 1929 and the World Depression, then the German economy was really, really badly hit once again. The Depression hits urban and industrial areas, but also the countryside, so foreclosures on farms, and this meant an absolute crisis right across, so in the cities and in the countryside.
The impact in Germany of the Great Depression was huge. I mean, really dire. You know, you've got millions of people, you know, thrown out of work, and you've got many, many major banks just collapsing.
The German economy had been rebuilt during the 1920s on foreign loans, particularly from America. These loans came called back in at a time when the German economy still needed injections of capital rather than that capital being removed.
You've got huge inflation, and by 1932, you've got about 6 million Germans unemployed. That's 10% of the entire population.
The rise of dictators tends to occur at times of great political, economic, and social crisis, or at times of political uncertainty and popular anxiety. So what these rulers do is to say to the to the people that they will offer a solution. They're going to rescue the nation.
Being no doubt that the German people are really pretty down. Most people are struggling to survive, and they're looking for a strong leader. They want someone to emerge who's going to take the country out of this kind of hell and transform it.
Absolute economic despair and crisis in Germany from the end of 1929 through the early 1930s, which provided a climate for Hitler to capitalize on. Of course, the German population was suffering enormously from the economic crisis. So, for ordinary families to put food on the table was difficult. Unemployment affecting so many families, young German men out on the streets, very despondent and hopeless, really. So in that climate of hopelessness and despair, Hitler promised something different. Hitler promised that he could make Germany great again and bring her out of this economic crisis.
14 Jahre lang haben diese Parteien die deutsche Freiheit vergewaltigt, den deutschen Menschen geknebelt und geschlagen. 2 oder 3 Monate vergangen sind, wird euer Terror beseitigt sein. Verwahren wir das Reichsrecht.
Hitler and the Nazi Party, they prepare to take advantage of the emergency. The emergency is kind of great for them because with their extremist politics, they can say, only we have the solution. And they're going to use this to gain support for their party. And what they also promise to do is to just sweep away the Versailles Treaty. And they say, we're going to strengthen the economy and we're going to provide jobs. No real mention of how, but it looks like a solution.
So that whilst the Nazi Party in 1928, before the Wall Street crash, had been polling a fractional percentage of the vote, in the elections of July 1932, the Nazi Party polled more than 37% of the vote. So this made it the largest party in Germany. So it was now a party to be reckoned with. So it was actually quite a symbiotic relationship. It was a kind of two-way street, that there's the population giving a large amount of consent and backing to these dictatorships. The reason for the success at the polls was that the Nazi Party seemed to offer something to everyone. So to the young people, it was a party of dynamism and youth. To the elderly and the pensioners who'd seen their life savings just decimate overnight, he could attract the old, he could attract men and women, even across the social classes. So he attracted support from among the aristocracy. The middle class, of course, was the biggest part of his vote, but also a quarter of German workers were voting for the Nazi Party too by this point.
But certainly within the first few years in which he was in power, and it seemed like the economy was going well, the majority of people in Germany, I think it's fair to say, really liked Hitler, and they thought that actually he is transforming our nation. Hitler had always viewed the whole democratic process as simply a means to get into power. And when he was in power, he wants to do everything he can to destroy it.
Hitler had quite a lot of disdain for the other political parties. He was convinced that his party was the one that was going to make a difference, and he was determined at the end of 1932 to accept not a vice-chancellorship, but only the top position. He was determined and uncompromising about being Chancellor of Germany. And when Hindenburg offered him this position, he hailed that as the Nazi seizure of power. So this was his moment.
Die Partei ist Hitler! Hitler aber ist Deutschland, wie Deutschland Hitler ist! Hitler, Sieg! Sieg! Sieg!
On the 27th of February 1933, the Reichstag building is set on fire. Hermann Goering says this is definitely a communist plot. And at Hitler's urging, Hindenburg, who's the president, responds by signing the Reichstag fire decree on the 28th of February, just the next day.
And this allowed the cabinet to have full autonomy and to take any steps it considered necessary in order to safeguard public order. So this was a fundamental step in Hitler's consolidation of power.
One of the first things Hitler does with the Reichstag decree is to basically suppress the activities of the German Communist Party. And he got 4,000 members arrested almost overnight.
Essentially, Hitler was able to maneuver the situation so that the Nazi Party became the only party. So we see the arrival of a one-party state.
It's very likely that the fire at the Reichstag was organised by the Nazis as a pretext for a kind of mass persecution of communists and social democrats in Germany. Of course, the purpose of the decree is, and the whole purpose of the fire, if the Nazis did indeed, set it, was to manufacture an excuse for repression and control. In the end, it doesn't matter whether the Nazis started or not. The fact is the Nazis used it as an excuse to gain more totalitarian power.
In uns selbst allein liegt die Zukunft des deutschen Volkes. Wenn wir selbst dieses deutsche Volk emporführen durch eigene Arbeit, durch eigenen Fleiß, eigene Entschlossenheit, eigenen Trotz, eigene Beharrlichkeit, dann werden wir wieder emporsteigen, genau wie die Väter einst auch Deutschland nicht des Selbst erhielten, sondern uns selbst den Schlappen mussten.
The Reichstag fire decree was swiftly followed by the Enabling Act. This was passed by the Reichstag on the 23rd of March 1933, giving the cabinet the right to rule by decree.
And what that does is to transfer the powers of legislation to Hitler's cabinet for 4 years. Now, what this does is to basically make him dictator. And that act gives Hitler's cabinet all the power it needs to enact more laws without the consent of the Reichstag, the parliament, for 4 years. What Hitler now does is to proclaim that the Nazi Party is the only political party permitted in Germany, and all other parties and trade unions are simply disbanded. That's it, they've gone. And you have Nazi officials becoming state governors. The takeover is now complete.
So Hitler seized power on the 30th of January 1933, and we see that he consolidated that power in a very short amount of time. So within the space of a year and a half, by the time that President Hindenburg died in August 1934, that was the last restraining influence on Hitler. And from that point on, he was not only Chancellor of Germany, but Führer. So he took all powers to himself.
And what he does is to abolish the title of president. So that is now giving him absolute power in Germany. He is now the head of state.
He made the army swear a personal oath of allegiance to him. So the army was swearing an oath of allegiance not to the German nation, but to Hitler personally in his role as Chancellor and Führer of the Reich.
Schwöre Adolf Hitler. Unverbrüchliche Treue. Unverbrüchliche Treue. Ihm und den mir von ihm bestimmten Führern. Ihm und den mir von ihm bestimmten Führern. Unbedingten Gehorsam. Unbedingten Gehorsam. Die größte Eidesleistung der Geschichte ist geschehen. Der Sieg heil! Sieg heil!
The Night of the Long Knives on the 30th of June 1934 was the occasion on which Hitler eliminated political rivals and potential rivals to his power.
The Night of the Long Knives was this brutal purge. And during it, Hitler orders a series of political extrajudicial executions. That's the polite way of saying murders. And what this was intended to achieve was to consolidate his grip on power.
Of course, once in power, they dismantled democracy, they suppressed all sorts of civil rights, they censored the press and any other kind of information. And of course, they were underpinned by violence and terror. In particular, he was determined to diminish the power of the stormtroopers, the SA, who he thought had become too powerful.
What the murders of these SA leaders, these brown shirt leaders, were also intended to achieve was to improve the image of Hitler's government with the German public that was becoming increasingly critical of what they saw as a very kind of thuggish tactics of the SA, of the brown shirts.
There was kind of some dubious reputation to these brown shirts and their violence on the streets. So he was kind of trying to prevent a second revolution on their part.
And Hitler is looking at the independence of the SA, and he's looking at its kind of reputation for street violence, and he's thinking, actually, I'm beyond these guys now. These guys are, making me look bad, and they're also representing a kind of alternative power base. They are a direct threat to my power. That's what he's thinking. The Nazi propaganda machine goes into full flow, and it says that these murders are committed as a kind of preventative measure to stop a coup, a supposed coup by a man called Ernst Röhm, in what was supposedly called the Röhm Putsch.
So particularly the leader of the SA, Ernst Röhm, was one of the people murdered that night.
The idea is that Röhm apparently was going to use the brown shirts to kind of take over the German state.
So not only was he the leader of the stormtroopers, he was also openly homosexual. So this allowed Hitler to portray the Nazis as defenders of public order or morality.
And while, there were many around the world and in Germany shocked by the murders, there were many who thought, actually, you know what? I think Hitler's done the right thing here.
The German population was kind of coming on side with the regime. And the reason for that was because Hitler was so far fulfilling his promises about turning around the economy.
Unemployment now falls from 6 million in 1932 to 1 million in 1936. And what Hitler masterminds and oversees is one of the largest infrastructure improvement campaigns ever in German history. Dams are being constructed, motorways are being constructed, railways, and scores of other big civil projects.
Throughout this period into the mid-1930s, with the putting people back to work and the public works schemes, he was attracting even the workers in some measure to the party and creating consensus for his regime.
Vor wenigen Monaten hat sich über der Bewegung ein schwarzer Schatten erhoben. Die SA hat so wenig als irgendeine andere Institution der Partei mit diesen Schatten etwas zu tun. Sie täuschen sich alle, die glauben, dass auch nur ein Riss in das Gefüge unserer einzigen Bewegung gekommen sei. Sie steht fest, so wie dieser Block hier.
The creation of an enemy was very important to the dictators, and that could be an internal enemy or an external enemy or both. After Hitler came to power, life for Germany's Jews took a severe turn for the worse.
The Jews in Germany were to feel the full effects of more than something like 400 decrees and regulations that restricted all aspects of their public lives and even their private lives.
So in the very early days and weeks after Hitler came to power, there was a boycott of Jewish shops and businesses. There was also an Aryan clause inserted into the civil service law, which removed Jewish civil servants from their jobs. All of that within the first few months. In the weeks and months that followed, Germany's Jews became increasingly isolated and excluded from one profession after another.
You have the Nuremberg race laws being passed in 1935, and these define Jews not by their religious belief, but by their ancestral lineage. And what these laws also do is to kind of formalize the segregation of the Jews away from the so-called Aryan population of Germany. It is basically creating the Jews as kind of internal foreigners, if you like.
So throughout the mid-1930s, the German propaganda machine was very busy putting out anti-Semitic propaganda, among other types of propaganda. So Julius Streicher's Der Stürmer put out a lot of anti-Semitic material, but the same was true from the propaganda ministry in terms of posters and placards, and as the years went on, anti-Semitic films, radio propaganda, and press propaganda too.
For the most part, a lot of Germans accepted the Nuremberg laws, partly because Nazi propaganda had successfully kind of swayed public opinion and fostered this general belief that Jews were a separate race. And also, no one wants to kind of oppose the regime because it would mean, you were going to leave yourself open to harassment or worse still, arrest by the Gestapo. A lot of people just kept their mouths shut. Anti-Semitism was not new for Hitler. I mean, he had been very publicly expressing and harboring really anti-Semitic views ever since the Nazis had published their 25-point program way back in 1920.
The Nuremberg laws marked a very significant moment in this history of the Third Reich and in the anti-Semitism, the escalating anti-Semitism of the Third Reich.
Und wenn die jüdischen Zeitungen heute glauben, auf versteckte Drohungen durch die nationalsozialistische Bewegung einschüchtern zu können, wenn sie heute glauben, unsere Notverordnungen umgehen zu dürfen, sie sollen sich hüten. Einmal wird unsere Geduld zu Ende sein und dann wird den Juden das freche Lügenmaul gestopft werden.
On the night of the 9th to 10th of November 1938, Goebbels, the propaganda minister, unleashed a pogrom. So this was a mass-scale attack in full public view of German Jewry.
A German diplomat called Ernst von Rath is assassinated. He's murdered by a 17-year-old German-born Polish Jew called Herschel Grinspan. And that is used as a pretext by the Nazis to carry out one of their most infamous actions.
The Night of the Broken Glass was a decisive turning point in Nazi anti-Semitic policy. So Hitler had always, back from Mein Kampf, talked about his hatred of the Jews. And here Goebbels had presented him with something that pleased him very much, because it was portrayed as this spontaneous response of the German population, although of course it was heavily and carefully orchestrated from above and by Goebbels. And yet this was something that very much fitted in with Hitler's worldview.
Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass, was this whole kind of series throughout Germany and German towns and cities of really repulsive actions against Jews. You have Jews being beaten up, you have Jews being killed, you have synagogues being burnt down, you have Jewish shops and businesses being vandalized and smashed up.
Tens of thousands of Jewish men were taken to concentration camps, and something like 91 people were murdered over the course of that night.
It was a really horrific night, and the world looked at it and realised this was a result of Nazism.
So this was a full-scale pogrom taking place for the first time in full view of the German public. And I think that was the thing that made it significant. So before there had been legal measures, there'd been violent attacks, but nothing on a public scale and on a nationwide scale as this before.
So I think, you can look at the Night of Broken Glass as being undoubtedly a precursor for what was going to come. And that, of course, was one of the darkest episodes in human history.
Engländer behaupten, das deutsche Volk wehrt sich gegen die totalen Kriegsmaßnahmen der Regierung. Es will nicht den totalen Krieg, sagen die Engländer, sondern die Kapitulation. Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg? Wollt ihr ihn, wenn nötig, totaler und radikaler, als wir ihn uns heute überhaupt erst vorstellen können? Seid ihr bereit, mit dem Führer als Phalanx der Heimat hinter der kämpfenden Wehrmacht stehen, diesen Kampf mit kühner Entschlossenheit und unbeirrt durch alle Schicksalsfügungen fortzusetzen, bis der Sieg in unseren Händen ist?
Throughout the course of the 1930s, he had torn up the Treaty of Versailles, one clause after another, got what he wanted without the need to resort to war. So in 1938, he got his Anschluss, his union with Austria. Following that, he took the Sudetenland and then the rest of Czechoslovakia. And then it comes to this point in September 1939, where he makes his attack on Poland. It was at that moment they went to war. This was a war that Hitler wanted. He was an out-and-out aggressor. He'd kind of got all of his aims up until then without even needing to go to war, and yet it was this moment that sparked the Second World War.
Hitler believed that this severe decline in living standards in Germany was a result of an economic crisis that could only really be stopped by military aggression.
The German population were a bit more reluctant to go to that war. But with all of these foreign policy successes that Hitler had achieved through the 1930s, his position as infallible and the kind of whole cult of the leadership that surrounded him had only continued to grow. And of course, the first months of the war were very successful for Germany, with the Blitzkrieg lightning strike on Poland, and then very quick successes in the West.
Mussolini is watching the progress of Hitler with actually quite a lot of jealousy. He's a bit bitter, to be honest. And as he sees each fresh German victory, he gets more and more livid. And he's starting to express the hope that maybe the Germans will be slowed down, or they'll have a defeat or some form of reverse. And that will make him feel a little bit better. We don't like it when our friends are too successful. And this is what's going on here. But Germany, of course, just advances westward, and not only takes all the Low Countries, but even, takes France. And when France is on the verge of collapse, Mussolini felt he can't delay any longer. So then on June the 10th, 1940, there's this fateful declaration of war. you know, this desire to just keep fighting and then to start fighting on multiple fronts is ultimately going to lead to Hitler's demise. Had Hitler stopped after he had successfully conquered France and the Low Countries and not decided in June 1941 that he was going to invade this really quite big country called Russia, he may have stayed in power.
Tide turned for Germany at the Battle of Stalingrad, and I think that the feeling that the German population had for him as this infallible leader really changed from that point onwards.
This is a war brought about by Hitler, and this is a war that Hitler has fought for too long, and he's fighting it to the death, and he's fighting it to the death of the people who he supposedly loves, and he no longer loves them by the end of the war. And he says that basically the German people don't deserve him, the German people don't deserve Germany, and everybody should fight to the death because basically, you know, they don't deserve to be alive because they failed him. Classic narcissistic thinking. The world is for him, you know, and he's not there for the world.
So whilst by this point, after Stalingrad, the cult of the leader was diminished somewhat, he'd created this myth of the Soviet hordes and this great Soviet enemy to such an extent that out of fear and out of desperation, both the army and the home front really worked until the bitter end before capitulation.
The first half of 1945 is probably the darkest 6 months in Germany's history because it's being invaded by, you know, the Russians, the Red Army from the east, and you've got the other allies coming through from the west. And it's the Russians who reach Berlin first. And when they reach Berlin, it's a city in rubble, it's a city in flames, it's a city in chaos, it's a city in which squads of marauding loyal Nazis are going around hanging people who are not taking part in the resistance to the city. It's a city in which you then got some Nazis committing suicide. It is the most benighted, appalling place you can imagine. And you've got the Soviet army literally raping and pillaging this city.
Towards the end of the war, of course, Hitler was spending more and more time in his mountain retreat, the Berghof, and then people were seeing less of him. He was making less and less public appearances, and then eventually, in the last months of the war, into the Führer bunker. And this is when public opinion of the Führer starts to crumble.
Hitler's last days in the Führer bunker under the Reich Chancellery in the centre of Berlin, you know, are a kind of terrible end of a Shakespearean tragedy, as the thunder Russian artillery all around them, and they're deep inside this sort of concrete underground fortress. Everybody's sort of kind of going mad, and especially Hitler.
Hitler and the Nazi leadership felt increasingly desperate as the Allied forces advanced closer and closer to Berlin. Nevertheless, in that desperation, they were all the more determined to fight to the bitter end and to bring the nation with them. He had not a moment of regret at the end of the war, so he put into place a scorched earth policy that he was going to destroy everything so that the victors wouldn't have anything to take when they arrived. But also he kind of in the end believed that the German people were not worthy of him. So he sort of got it in his head somehow that they weren't this master race after all, and that they had betrayed him. Even though, of course, the ultimate lie was what he had done to them.
On the 28th of April, 1945, Mussolini is shot dead by partisans in the north of Italy while he's attempting to flee to try and get on a plane. The day after Mussolini is killed, on the 29th of April 1945, his corpse and that of his mistress, Clara Petacci, they're dragged along and they're dumped on the ground in front of the old Piazzale Loreto. And they're kicked and they're spat upon, and then the bodies are then hung upside down from the roof of an Esso petrol station. And then the bodies are then stoned. I mean, it's kind of endless abuse of these corpses by civilians. One man who sees what happens to Mussolini's corpse and learns from it is, of course, Adolf Hitler. And it's the abuse of Mussolini's corpse that leads Hitler to make a decision to actually kill himself, a few days later.
On the 30th of April 1945, Hitler committed suicide with his new wife, Eva Braun. So he shot himself. She took a cyanide tablet, determined to be a beautiful corpse.
Hitler committed suicide, but so too did his propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels. What was particularly horrific about Goebbels' suicide was that he and his wife actually killed all their children before they killed themselves, because they couldn't face the idea of a world without Adolf Hitler, and they didn't think their children should have that fate.
Hitler's personal anti-Semitism came to be translated into state policy, and as the years progressed, the policies became more and more radical.
The final solution to the Jewish question, it's a kind of horrific phrase, if you like, but that was the kind of official name for the murder of all Jews that the Nazis could get their hands on. And it wasn't just restricted to the European continent.
They tried a variety of different policies, from emigration to territorial solutions, and eventually they settled on the mass murder of European Jewry through the use of poison gas, carbon monoxide gas.
The international community had a very good idea from the word go that the Nazis were anti-Semitic, but I don't think anybody believed that Jews were going to be killed on an industrial scale. It was a fully fledged industrial genocide.
The Jews were murdered in thousands at a time in gas chambers, and then their bodies were subsequently cremated.
When the Allied forces turned up at the camps, places like Belsen, the world was horrified when they saw the footage that emerged. Corpses piled up, having to be bulldozed into pits. And the Allied forces, when they saw what had been done to all these people in the camps, they often got local Germans in to come and see what had been done in their name. And obviously they also made, some of the people running the camps, the SS, not only help, clean up the camps and dispose of the bodies, but obviously there was also summary justice. Even though it's not kind of officially recorded, there are many stories of troops getting absolutely livid with some of the SS who ran the camps and just shooting them out of hand.
The question of how much the Germans knew about what had happened to the Jewish population is very complex. So certainly they knew that their Jewish compatriots were disappearing, being taken away. They were being taken away, they believed, as indeed some of the Jewish people themselves believed, they were taken away to work in the East.
During the war, word leaked out from people who had escaped some camps. There were aerial pictures taken of places like Auschwitz. So, by the middle of the war, the world at large had a very good idea that this slaughter was being carried out on an industrial scale.
Yes, some rumours did circulate back from soldiers on leave, and other information did filter back to the Reich, but the German population was busy with facing its own war, dealing on a day-to-day basis with the course of the war, Allied bombings, rationing, food shortages.
It took a long time for the German people to really come to terms with what had been done in their name. I think a lot of German people throughout the war had more than an inkling, but I don't think they knew the extent of the savagery of what went on, behind those miles upon miles of barbed wire.
There was a deliberate policy on the part of the Nazis that this extermination should take place not on German soil. So these death camps were all in Poland, so they were out of the direct line of vision of the German population.
As well as places like Auschwitz, which were relatively easy to keep quite secret, what people also knew about from troops returning from the front, and especially from the Eastern Front, was the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads that went behind the German lines, killing anybody they regarded as being an enemy of the Third Reich, such as Jews and communists and so on. And the Einsatzgruppen killed millions of people, and it was impossible to keep that quiet.
So once again, there had been some knowledge, but limited knowledge about the extent of what the Nazi regime was putting into place in terms of this genocide that was taking place in the death camps.
When the Germans fully appreciated what had been done in their name by the Nazis, it took a very long time for that to sink in. If you look at public opinion polls carried out in the 40s and the 50s in Germany, there was still a lot of residual affection for Nazism. It was felt that this was something that had made Germany great again. It was something that had got things moving and done. Yes, there had been excesses, the small matter of the Holocaust, clearly, but some people in Germany were willing just to say, if we can divorce the kind of genocide bit from Nazism, is Nazism so bad? So there was still this sort of kind of, I'm not saying all Germans, but a minority of Germans were still, affectionate towards Nazism and towards Hitler. But I think, yes, ultimately when it was shown quite how evil Nazism was and the German people fully appreciated it, then yes, the opinion of Hitler was not quite so positive.
The historical significance of the Holocaust, of course, was that once the full horrors of Nazi policy became known, the watchword after that was nie wieder, never again, that these kinds of atrocities should never be allowed to occur again. And yet in the period after 1945, so through the end of the 20th century and into the 21st, we have seen genocides continue to take place.
Certainly, there are a lot of reasons why you might have voted for Hitler in the 30s, not all of which involved you being evil. But certainly, if you are a fan of Hitler after the war still, and after all the revelations that have come out, then I would say you definitely are evil.
There was not really much opposition to Hitler, either from those around him or even any resistance on much of a wide scale in Germany as a whole. So very limited resistance. Those around him were always trying to curry favor with him. So whatever they were trying to do, they called it working towards the Führer. His view was well known. And in fact, all of his advisors, ministers, and armed forces were mainly trying to impress him and to try to enable him to achieve his goals. We have to understand that Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels, so some of the key Nazi leaders, committed suicide, and that was their way of not having to deal with the consequences of the Nazi regime.
In some ways, Hitler cheated by killing himself. He got away with any punishment for all the suffering he had caused, not only to Germany, but of course to the world. And it was actually his generals and his inner circle who are going to pay the price.